In the final years of the Third Reich, Adolf Hitler's generalship became a microcosm of loyalty and betrayal, where devotion to the Führer clashed with the reality of a lost war. The Wehrmacht, which had been Germany's proud military force, found itself worn out and demoralized. As defeats piled up, the pressure on the generals increased. Many of them, who had once been fervent defenders of the Nazi regime, began to question their loyalty. In this context, desertion became an act of desperation with severe consequences. It is estimated that around 40,000 soldiers were sentenced to death for desertion, of which more than two-thirds are believed to have been executed. The orders were clear: he who fights at the front may die, he who deserts must die. Therefore, some remained loyal. Their closeness to National Socialist ideology, their stubbornness, or even their vain illusion of a possible victory did not allow them to desert. Here are some examples. From a young age, Walter Model showed interest in military life, joining the German army in 1910. In 1930, he joined the Truppenamt, a covert organization that worked on Germany's rearmament, which laid the foundation for his future as a military commander. 8 years later, he reached the rank of Major General and assumed the position of Chief of Staff of the 4th Army Corps. His reputation as a competent and meticulous officer began to attract the attention of high command, including Adolf Hitler, who saw in him a promising figure for the operations of the Third Reich. With the onset of World War II, he played a crucial role. In June 1941, he led the 3rd Panzer Division during Operation Barbarossa, a massive offensive against the Soviet Union. His aggressiveness and tactical ability allowed him to overcome Soviet defenses in Brest and Rogachev, reaching the Dnieper River in early July. These actions solidified his position within the army, being promoted to Colonel General in January 7 months later, and receiving the Oak Leaves to the Knight's Cross for his performance in defensive operations. In July 1943, Model led the northern offensive in the Battle of Kursk, part of Operation Citadel. Despite his warnings about the lack of preparedness, his troops faced solid Soviet defenses, resulting in heavy losses for the German army and a significant strategic blow. However, his ability to adapt to adverse situations led to his designation in January 1944 as commander of Army Group North, where he implemented tactical retreats that stabilized the front during a critical period. In March, Walter was promoted to Field Marshal, and in August of the same year, he assumed command of Army Group B on the Western Front, playing a key role in containing Allied forces during Operation Market Garden. 3 months later, Operation Bagration, launched by the Soviet Union, dealt a devastating blow to German forces in Belarus. As commander of Army Group Center, Model faced an overwhelming Soviet offensive that resulted in catastrophic losses for the Wehrmacht. This defeat significantly weakened the Eastern Front and reduced his influence within the German High Command. Towards the end of the year, Walter led the offensive in the Ardennes, known as the Battle of the Bulge. Initially, German troops made notable advances, but the lack of resources and American resistance thwarted the operation in January 1945. This failure, one of Germany's last significant attempts to change the course of the war, deteriorated the relationship between him and the Chancellor. In the early months of 1945, the situation for him became desperate. American forces crossed the Rhine River in March, advancing rapidly into Germany's interior and leaving Army Group B, which he commanded, increasingly isolated. The Allied advance disrupted supply and communication lines, dismantling German resistance capability. By the end of March, his troops were trapped in the Ruhr Pocket, a critical industrial area for the German war effort. Despite his experience in defensive tactics, Model failed to organize an effective counteroffensive against the overwhelming Allied superiority. He had approximately 70 operational tanks, an insignificant number compared to the thousands of Allied armored vehicles. Additionally, supplies were insufficient and the soldiers' morale was declining. Despite receiving orders to resist to the last man, he was aware of his troops' limitations. On April 1st, in an attempt to reverse his fate, he sent an emissary to Berlin to request permission from Hitler to break the encirclement and withdraw. However, the chaos reigning in the German capital reflected the gravity of the situation. The Chancellor, trapped in his intransigent ideology, insisted on maintaining the position at all costs. This refusal faced Walther's military pragmatism with the Führer's biased orders, increasing his frustration and isolation. By April 5th, conditions in the Ruhr pocket were critical, communications were sporadic, and the defensive lines were on the verge of collapse. Facing this reality, the general made an unprecedented decision. He allowed battalion commanders to dissolve their units and surrender if they deemed it necessary. This order marked a shift in his approach, showing his concern for minimizing human losses in a hopeless situation. The pressure from the exhausted and hungry soldiers was compounded by that of the civilian population demanding an end to the conflict. On April 16th, defeated, he toured several front-line positions and spoke directly with his soldiers. Recognizing the impossibility of continuing the resistance, he granted them permission to surrender or return home. During these visits, he reflected on the meaning of his situation, describing it as the crushing phase of the war. His words denoted a resigned acceptance of defeat and deep self-criticism over whether his actions throughout the conflict had been justifiable. In his final days, as Allied troops rapidly advanced towards Berlin and the Soviets intensified their offensives, Model also faced the specter of personal surrender and responsibility for the atrocities committed on the Eastern Front. Although he was loyal to his oath to Hitler, remaining in place until the end, he understood that continuing to fight would only increase unnecessary casualties among his men. Finally, on April 15th, he ordered the official dissolution of Army Group B, leaving his troops the option to surrender. From the bunker, Hans Krebs's desperation in Berlin. Hans Krebs began his military life as a volunteer in the Imperial German Army during World War I, where he quickly rose to officer rank. With the end of that conflict, he continued serving in the Reichswehr, the army of the Weimar Republic, consolidating his military experience and preparing for the career he would develop under the Nazi government. In 1931, he started working in the Ministry of Defense, getting involved in joint exercises with the Soviet Union, an experience that allowed him to establish strategic contacts. Later, in the second half of that decade, he served as a military attaché in Moscow, where he gathered intelligence on Soviet military capabilities. At the beginning of World War II, Hans assumed the position of head of the Army's training section, contributing to operational planning. In the following years, between 1930 and 1942, he was Chief of Staff of the 7th Corps, participating in the early campaigns that marked the initial successes of the Third Reich. In February 1942, he was promoted to Major General and assigned as Chief of Staff of the 9th Army on the Eastern Front, where he played a key role in operations against Soviet forces. In March of the following year, he became Chief of Staff of Army Group Center, overseeing significant battles in the East. Nearly 13 months later, Krebs reached the rank of Lieutenant General, advancing in his prestige within the military hierarchy. A year later, in August, he was appointed General of Infantry and assumed command as Chief of Staff of Army Group B on the Western Front. By that time, Germany's situation was increasingly critical, with deteriorating fronts both in the East and the West. The failed Ardennes offensive at the end of that year highlighted the progressive loss of capacity of the German armed forces. At the beginning of 1945, Soviet armies were advancing rapidly towards Eastern Europe, while Western allies crossed the Rhine River in March, consolidating their offensive towards the heart of Germany. In February, he was appointed Deputy Chief of the General Staff of the Army, solidifying his position as a key figure in the high command during the war's final months. Executing this task was no easy feat. He faced a scenario of military and logistical disintegration. His role consisted of coordinating defenses and organizing counterattacks with increasingly limited resources. Despite his efforts, German lines were fragmented and supply routes inoperative. Desperation permeated the attempts to resist the enemy advance, while Axis forces were in retreat. On April 1st, he assumed the position of Chief of Staff of the OKH, placing him at the epicenter of military decisions as Berlin faced inevitable defeat. By that time, with Soviet troops surrounding Berlin, Krebs was in the Führer bunker, the operations center of a regime on the verge of collapse. Communications with other commanders reflected the gravity of the situation. The units tasked with liberating Berlin were either trapped or decimated, and constant Red Army bombings were depleting German defenses. The city was surrounded and under relentless assault. Finally, the Nazi regime was collapsing. On April 28th, Hans contacted Marshal Wilhelm Keitel to inform him of the city's imminent fall if reinforcements did not arrive within 48 hours. However, his pleas were futile, as no troops were available to counter the Soviet onslaught. The psychological pressure grew as the collapse became inevitable. The atmosphere in the Führer bunker oscillated between despair and resignation. With the fateful end of the Reich's leader on April 30th, the chain of command was fractured. Therefore, on May 1st, Hans met with Soviet General Vasily Chuikov in an attempt to negotiate a truce. During the meeting, he informed Chuikov of Hitler's physical disappearance and presented a document signed by Joseph Goebbels and Martin Bormann that included the terms of a possible surrender. However, Stalin's demands for unconditional surrender blocked any progress. This meeting symbolized the end of his role as an active military leader and his transition to a figure relegated to managing an inevitable defeat. That same night, Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister, took his own life along with his wife after poisoning their children. The psychological deterioration of those remaining in the bunker was evident, and Krebs was no exception. His authority was diminished as General Helmuth Weidling assumed responsibility for the surrender negotiations. The early hours of May 2nd marked the final outcome. With Soviet troops about to take the bunker, he and Wilhelm Burgdorf made the same final decision as the Chancellor and Goebbels to avoid capture. The Circle of Death, Burgdorf and the Last Decisions of the Nazi Regime. Wilhelm Burgdorf began his military career as a cadet in the Prussian army during World War I. After the conflict, he remained in the Reichswehr, where he continued to gain experience and rise through the ranks. In 1930, he reached the rank of captain, performing various roles including tactics instructor at the Dresden Military Academy. 7 years later, he was appointed aide to the General Staff of the 9th Corps, expanding his influence and opening new opportunities. Between May 1940 and April 1942, he commanded the 529th Infantry Regiment, part of the 299th Division. In May 1942, he was promoted to head of Department 2 of the Army Personnel Office, beginning to exert significant influence in administrative matters within the Wehrmacht. In October of the same year, he assumed the position of Deputy Chief of the same office, reaching the rank of Major General. These appointments reflected the High Command's trust in him and his alignment with the Third Reich's power structure. 2 years later, in the same month, Wilhelm was appointed head of the Army Personnel Office and principal aide to Adolf Hitler. As Chief of Personnel, he was responsible for maintaining the officer's loyalty to the Chancellor, issuing strict orders that threatened severe reprisals against those who expressed doubts about an eventual German victory. This repressive approach illustrated the atmosphere of paranoia and repression that dominated the military ranks in the war's final months. The constant loss of territory and lack of resources generated internal tensions, while the Nazi leadership relied on figures like him to ensure discipline in an army on the brink of collapse. On November 1st of the same year, he was promoted to Lieutenant General, later reaching the rank of General of Infantry, consolidating himself as one of the most influential figures in Nazi military leadership. One of the most notorious episodes of his career occurred around that time, when he actively participated in orchestrating the forced suicide of Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, accused of conspiring against Hitler. This event underscored Burgdorf's loyalty to the regime and his role as executor of the harshest orders. In early 1945, with Soviet forces surrounding Berlin, Wilhelm moved to the Führer bunker, the underground refuge that became the Chancellery's operations center during the conflict's final days. As head of the Army Personnel Office and one of the top aides to the Supreme Leader, he was part of the most critical decisions made in April of that year, in a context where German defeat was imminent. During meetings in the bunker, Hitler reiterated his determination to resist to the end, a stance the general fervently supported. From his position, he was responsible for maintaining discipline and the appearance of order within a rapidly disintegrating command. His commitment to the Führer's decisions remained even when the reality of their situation was impossible to ignore. On April 28th, he participated in the War Council that judged Hermann Fegelein, an SS liaison officer and Eva Braun's brother-in-law, accused of treason after attempting to desert. This trial symbolized the growing paranoia and distrust among Nazi leaders in their final moments. A day later, on April 29th, Burgdorf was one of the few high-ranking officers present to witness and sign Hitler's political and personal testament. This document, reflecting the Führer's final narrative on betrayal and resistance, also solidified his position as one of the last loyalists in the leader's inner circle. With Soviet troops encircling Berlin, Wilhelm categorically rejected any discussion of the possibility of surrender. His opposition to civilian officials' suggestions to negotiate with the Allies made clear his devotion to Hitler's orders and rejection of any deviation from his mandate. This stance reflected not only his ideology, but also the fear of reprisals that any hint of weakness within the regime would bring. The atmosphere inside the Führer bunker was one of chaos and despair. The accumulated defeats generated tensions that Burgdorf tried to quell through threats, and a severe attitude towards those suggesting abandoning the fight. In this climate of collapse, he continued to defend resistance to the last moment, embodying the relentless and stubborn character that defined many Nazi leaders during the Third Reich's final days. On May 2nd, with Soviet troops about to capture the center of Berlin, Wilhelm chose to leave this world, following the same decision as other high-ranking regime officials. Defenders of collapse, Krüger and the end of the Wehrmacht. With Adolf Hitler's rise to power, the German rearmament process offered Walter Krüger new opportunities for advancement. In the years leading up to the outbreak of World War II, he held various staff positions that strengthened his leadership skills. In 1939, as the war began, Walter reached the rank of Major General. After his success in Poland, he was promoted to Lieutenant General the following year. Under his direction, his division participated in the rapid and successful German operations in Western Europe. The following year, he led the 6th SS Army Corps during Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, facing significant challenges on the vast Eastern Front. In 1942, Krüger was appointed commander of the 4th Field Army, playing a central role in key operations on the Eastern Front. The following year, he was promoted to General of Infantry, placing him at the helm of Army Group Center's operations. This period was characterized by intense battles against the Soviet advance, constantly testing his personal command capabilities and the resources of his troops. As the war turned against Germany, he assumed increasingly critical defensive responsibilities. Throughout 1944, he organized actions aimed at slowing the Allied advance both in the East and the West, facing a landscape of increasing military pressure and dwindling available resources. This was a particularly difficult year. As time passed, the situation for Germany in World War II became increasingly desperate. In the early months of 1945, he was appointed commander of Army Group Vistula, tasked with coordinating German defenses against the Soviet advance towards Berlin. The situation was no more encouraging for the Germans, as Soviet forces advanced rapidly from the east, reclaiming vast territories lost during the conflict's early years. Additionally, logistical problems and low troop morale greatly hindered their efforts. The Wehrmacht suffered severe shortages of supplies, equipment, and reinforcements, preventing any effective resistance against the enemy advance. In March, Krüger faced a critical situation, attempting to reorganize defenses with increasingly limited resources. To make matters worse, the Red Army was approaching Berlin, and German defenses were crumbling under relentless Soviet attacks. Strategic bombing campaigns by Allied forces had devastated German infrastructure, further aggravating supply shortages for frontline units. In April, as the Soviets surrounded Berlin and German positions collapsed, he commanded his last operations. By this time, Walter's forces were no longer capable of mounting effective counterattacks or adequately defending their positions against the overwhelming Soviet assault. The rapid loss of territory was accompanied by widespread demoralization among German commanders, who began to realize that defeat was inevitable. Throughout the latter part of April, Krüger tried to maintain order within his forces as Soviet pressure intensified. He sought to coordinate with other German commanders in the region to form a unified front against the enemy. But constant communication failures and contradictory orders from Nazi leadership made this task difficult. Desperation grew among the troops, who saw units crumble under the weight of defeat. Reports from the front lines indicated that many soldiers abandoned their posts or refused to fight. After the dictator's death, he was forced to face the reality of surrender. With no hope of relief or a successful counteroffensive, the pressure from both his superiors and his own soldiers became unbearable. As May 1st approached, Walter's ability to influence events was greatly reduced. Although he was not directly involved in the negotiations, he was aware that the responsibility for surrendering Berlin would soon fall on him or his subordinate commanders. Negotiations with the Soviets quickly failed, as Soviet forces only accepted unconditional surrender. Finally, with Germany's unconditional surrender in May, his military career concluded amidst the total defeat of the Nazi regime. With surrender imminent, Krüger's role shifted from being an active military leader to a spectator of the Third Reich's final collapse, choosing to take the same action as Hitler, but on May 22nd. From glory to disgrace, the rise and fall of a field marshal. In the 1920s, after his service in World War I, Robert Ritter von Greim tried to pursue a career in law, but was invited to China to help modernize the country's air force. There he established a flying school and assisted in creating a new air structure. He returned to Germany in 1933, where he was recruited by Hermann Göring to help rebuild the Luftwaffe, which had been severely limited by the Treaty of Versailles. A year later, Robert became commander of the Luftwaffe's first fighter pilot school. 4 years later, he was promoted to General Major and took command of the Jagdgeschwader 132 Richthofen, a Luftwaffe fighter unit. His career continued to rise, and in September 1939, he actively participated as a commander during the invasion of Poland. The following year, he was promoted to Lieutenant General and later reached the rank of General of Aviators. Another year passed before he took command of the newly formed Sonderstab Krim, where he oversaw air operations on the Eastern Front. 2 years later, he took command of Luftflotte 6, supporting Army Group Center during crucial battles such as Kursk. As April progressed, operational difficulties became even more evident. The Luftwaffe had been reduced to a fraction of its original strength, with many planes out of service due to a lack of fuel and spare parts. Despite his high rank and authority, Greim could do nothing to change the dire circumstances faced by the German Air Force. He made a dangerous flight to Berlin, accompanied by Hanna Reich, a test pilot and close associate. They flew in a Focke-Wulf FW-190 combat aircraft, but were wounded upon landing due to anti-aircraft fire. Together they flew through intense anti-aircraft fire, demonstrating his commitment to the regime despite the evident collapse of military operations. Upon arriving on April 24th, he met with Hitler in the Führerbunker, where he was tasked with organizing the city's air defenses. The following day, he was promoted to Field Marshal and appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Luftwaffe, succeeding Göring in this role, although his tenure was brief due to Germany's imminent defeat. This appointment reflected the regime's desperation, as he was the last person to be promoted to Field Marshal in Nazi Germany. The situation quickly worsened, and the Battle of Berlin, which took place during those days, marked the pinnacle of the Luftwaffe's futile efforts. Greim's actions were mainly symbolic and futile, as he tried to secure support and resources for a rapidly crumbling defense. On April 28th, he left Berlin on the Chancellor's orders as Soviet forces approached. The Führer's paranoia and the disintegration of command within the Nazi hierarchy were unstoppable. His departure from Berlin was not just a tactical retreat, but an acknowledgement that defending the capital had become increasingly futile. With Germany's surrender on May 8, 1945, the field marshal was captured by American forces in Austria. It is said that his initial reaction to the capture reflected his disillusionment. He reportedly declared, "I am the head of the Luftwaffe, but I have no Luftwaffe," highlighting the loss of authority and control over what was once a powerful military branch. The decline of the war deeply affected him, and he spent his last days grappling with defeat and loss of purpose while becoming a prisoner awaiting an uncertain fate. On May 24th, fearing he would be handed over to the Soviets and tortured, Greim decided to take his own life in an American-controlled prison. Sieg and Fall, the rise and end of Günther Angern in the Wehrmacht. In the interwar period, Günther Angern joined the newly established Wehrmacht during the rearmament of Germany under the Nazi regime. In 1938, he was appointed commander of the 3rd Schützen Brigade, marking the beginning of his ascent within the military hierarchy. When World War II began, he led the 11th Schützen Brigade, actively participating in the German invasion of Poland. By August 1940, he had already been promoted to the rank of Oberst and received the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross in recognition of his leadership and bravery during combat operations. In August 1941, Günther was appointed commander of the 11th Panzer Division during Operation Barbarossa. However, his command was brief, as just 9 days later he was seriously wounded, forcing him to spend time recovering. Despite his injury, Angern was promoted to brigadier general and received the German Cross in Gold, a recognition of his efforts and contributions to the war. In September 1942, he returned to active duty and assumed command of the 16th Panzer Division, which was involved in operations near Stalingrad, considered strategic by both the Germans and Soviets. This siege not only affected his division, but also elements of the 6th Armored Division, turning the situation into a catastrophe for the Germans. The siege of Stalingrad represented a turning point in the war, as it was the Wehrmacht's first major defeat, breaking the myth of invincibility that had surrounded the German forces until that point. The situation worsened when the German forces were unable to break the siege or receive adequate reinforcements. As the siege tightened, he was under extreme pressure to maintain order and discipline among his troops. The situation further complicated when Angern's division suffered significant casualties, reducing it to around 4,000 men. During the Soviet counteroffensive that surrounded Stalingrad, Angern received orders to retreat to the Donets River. Despite the grave situation, he remained in command of his unit during the city's siege. His troops faced severe shortages of supplies, including food and ammunition. The harsh winter conditions further worsened the situation, leading to morale problems among the troops, who were increasingly aware of the precariousness of their situation. On January 21, 1943, in the midst of the siege, he was promoted to lieutenant general. By this time, reports indicated that morale among the German troops had fallen considerably. The idea of being trapped with little hope of rescue or escape created a general atmosphere of despair. Despite the growing Soviet pressure, he remained with his division. When it became evident that the possibility of breaking the siege was virtually nil and the situation was rapidly deteriorating, he and some of his officers began contemplating an escape plan. They considered disguising themselves in captured Soviet uniforms and attempting to cross enemy lines with the help of Soviet auxiliaries known as Hueys. This plan reflected the desperation of all the commanders but was never carried out. On February 2nd, facing imminent capture and total defeat, Günther Angern took his own life in Stalingrad.